Greetings and welcome to this course on human rights law and government for the summer of 2026. This is an intensive course, so it's only going to take 7 weeks or 7.5, but we have to accomplish the same amount of content as though it were a traditional 15-week course. So we have to kind of pack 2 weeks into 1 week, or 15 weeks into 7.5 weeks. So that's the nature of these summer intensive courses. I think it's unique. We're kind of starting right here at the time of the 4th of July, a major moment in the history of the United States when the Declaration of Independence, which is celebrated every July 4th, was first presented and ratified or endorsed and made a dramatic impact, certainly in the United States as a founding document, but over time globally, as there are over 100 nations that in some respects looked to and imitated, referenced aspects of this Declaration of Independence. And some of you, as we go through these documents, you may want to look at some of your own founding documents or your Constitution even, and look for language or principles or even wording that is similar to wording found in the Declaration or in the U.S. Constitution. We have a nice and diverse class. We have about 14 students, approximately 5 from Africa, another 5 from Southeast Asia, 1 from South America, and about 3 based in Europe or the Middle East. Interestingly, I don't believe we have anyone who based here in the United States. So this will be an asynchronous course, although I will schedule some Zoom meetings. Everyone won't be required to attend, but I encourage you to attend. We can keep them brief. Maybe I'll try to schedule 2, and I might even do them one kind of in the more for Asia and one for North America, Africa, and Europe and South America, so that it's time zone convenient. Even though it's asynchronous in all my classes, I try to get a little FaceTime on Zoom so that we can get to know each other, and sometimes that provides an opportunity to ask questions or clarify points through kind of virtual face-to-face dialogue. So again, 14 students, 5 from Africa, 5 from Southeast Asia primarily, 3 from Europe, Middle East, and 1 from South America. Countries include Argentina, Tanzania, Lebanon, Albania, South Africa, Singapore, Liberia, Cambodia, Philippines. I'm looking forward to it. If we're addressing important topics, rather broad, human rights, law, and government, kind of the political sphere. It will relate to international relations, international law. We'll look at the United Nations. So covering a lot of important ground that is pretty foundational to those of you in the Master of Arts program in Peace Studies. I want to share the syllabus briefly if I can find it here. Sorry, that's not it. So I think I've sent you the syllabus, or you should have it, but just let me summarize some of the key points. That most of the readings that you will be assigned are can be found online. I think I've provided virtually all of the readings and your assignments during this 7.5 weeks, so you shouldn't have to purchase any books. Please keep up with the readings and review the syllabus. It has important information there about it contains a rubric with our goals for learning outcomes for the course, and it has important information about things such as plagiarism and the use of AI in writing, and that students should not rely on AI to replace their own writing, their own thinking. It doesn't mean you can't consult or use AI in some cases to help with the writing style or grammar, but the content should be your own. When it's not your own, that's when you acknowledge the source. So that's very important in graduate study and doing any kind of scholarly or academic work, to cite your sources when the source is not you yourself. And citing another source is not something to be embarrassed about, or because I don't know, that's what scholars do. All scholars recognize that information is widely shared, and there are experts and scholars with great information. And when I draw upon those other scholars, those other writings, I should not present it as though it were my own, but I should reference the source from where I got that information. So please review the syllabus carefully. Canvas, which you are now using if you're watching this recording, is the platform. So for weekly assignments, or the 8 modules that you will find in Canvas, please refer to that for the weekly assignments. There may be some slight differences from the syllabus as I originally drafted it, because as we go through week by week, I may make little tweaks as I see how we're doing as a class. So focus on the modules week to week. I sent you an email that has your first week assignments. We will be focusing for this lecture and this week on the Declaration of Independence in honor of this 250th anniversary, which takes place on July 4th here in the United States as Independence Day, the 250th birthday. So please follow in Canvas. My email is in there, t.walsh@hjai.edu, and feel free to reach out to me at any time. Having said that, I'm going to go through, let's see, I think I just was able to get the syllabus. I hope you can see this. Just so we have a course description here. I'm going to go through this quickly. These are our kind of learning outcomes that we understand human rights in constitutional systems, understand the concept of the rule of law and how that evolved and developed, distinguish between kind of international law related to international relations and domestic law within the confines of a particular state. And we also be looking at issues related to the relationship between religion and the state, particularly religious freedom. This is a course rubric where we state the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve and then the different levels. And you should be aspiring to get into this mastery exceptional level. So please review this rubric. This states the requirements for the course. You will have a final term paper, so rather quickly you should start to think about what topic you will focus on. Here it says you will participate in 2 Zoom meetings with the instructor during the course, even if we have to schedule it individually. It won't be a long meeting, but I do want to have some time on Zoom with each of you. So there will be weekly written assignments indicated on Canvas, and of course, assigned readings and even videos to view. We are asynchronous, and on the Canvas platform, we'll have 5 written assignments that are 5 points each that will count 25% of your grade, 2 short essays, meaning they're a little bit longer, and you'll need to use some bibliography with citations, meaning footnotes or endnotes. And that will be, each of those is 15 points toward your final grade, or 30% of the final grade. The 2 Zoom meetings will be 10%, and the final term paper 35%. A little bit about technicalities of grading. This is where I referenced academic integrity and etiquette. These are some of the required texts. None of them are you required to buy. They will be assigned in various modules, and that will be indicated clearly in each module. Then on Canvas, you'll have these modules spelled out. And as I said, don't rely on the syllabus 100%, but focus on what's there in Canvas. Again, that will be more accurate than the syllabus, which was created a month or so ago. And as we go through the course, I will make little tweaks as we go week to week. These are just guidelines for your final term paper. Again, that term paper will come quickly, so please give thought to it. Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I hope it will come up. Sorry, my apologies. Okay, sorry about that. Got a lot of documents. Okay, founding documents and ideas underlying the founding of the USA. We'll be kind of talking in this first section on what are called the Articles of Confederation and the Declaration of Independence in particular. A lot of the background concepts that are emerging at this time in history were in the 18th century. It is 1776 when the Declaration is ratified and becomes a public document and a declaration of that independence, which is really giving rise to a call for a separation from the control or over lordship of the British Empire. So the concept of rights becomes very important. And before this period, this word had a very limited use in English usage. In the legal sense, a right was nothing more than a valid title of ownership, especially as it related to real property, land. But amid the great political, religious disputes of the 17th century, the word right shed its original limited meaning and began to acquire its bewildering modern association. So rights became more widely claimed in a variety, and that is evidenced in the Declaration of Independence. A right is a moral or legal entitlement to have or obtain something or to act in a certain way, an entitlement. And these rights can be claimed as based in natural law, that they are inherent, or as the Declaration will say, they are self-evident. They're endowed by our Creator. They're written in nature and nature's law. These are some of the language of the Declaration. Rights may also be articulated in positive law, in legislation, or in a Bill of Rights that becomes approved or ratified by government. And then you have a right to privacy or a right to religious freedom, and that is enshrined sometimes in a constitution or in a Bill of Rights, such as in the United States. Positive rights then are rights that are kind of established by government. Natural law would claim these rights precede even government. And as the Declaration will say, governments are created to protect those unalienable rights that are God-given. But if we look at positive law, say the right of religious freedom or freedom of the press or freedom of assembly or the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment of the U.S. Bill of Rights or Constitution, How are positive rights created? They can come from common law, law as it is developed over time in a particular country or region. Positive rights, such as the amendments to the Constitution in the US, become part of the Constitution, or rights can be articulated by the legislature or other branch of a government. And sometimes rights are there within private contracts. Like if I sell you my automobile and we sign a contract, then you have a right. If you give, I have a right to receive the money and you have a right to receive the automobile. And if either of us violate that, we're violating the contract and to that same extent, violating one another's rights. Rights written into a constitution like the United States are restrictions on government conduct. A key figure lying in the background and someone who was read by the founding fathers of the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was the British philosopher, political philosopher, John Locke, who lived in the 17th century, 1632 to 1704. And he also developed this theory of unalienable rights, like rights rooted in nature, in human nature or natural law, and implying or stating that these are part of the nature of things, and the nature of things is established by God. And for Locke, these core underlying unalienable rights were that we have the right to life. That means if someone tries to take our life, we have the right to defend ourselves because this right is unalienable. No one can, without reason, try to take my life. Of course, if I'm trying to harm someone else, then some other person it is legitimate to defend themselves. A second unalienable right is liberty, freedom, that I should be free to do whatever I like so long as I am not bringing harm to others. And Locke said the third major right is the right that if I labor the land, work the land, then I am entitled to, I have a right to the property. Or if I build something, or if I farm and produce crops, I have a right to that as my property. If I raise animals and they reproduce and I sell, I have the right to that property. It's linked to the labor and the investment that I have put into it. And Locke also talks about the formation of a government and innovative ideas such as that power should belong with the people, ultimately not to the king or the monarch, but it is the people who ultimately decide on the government. And it's the people who agree to grant certain powers to the government. There was another political philosopher called Thomas Hobbes who wrote about a famous book called The Leviathan, that the government becomes this centralized authority, but that the people agree to establish this kind of central government in order to secure their own protection and their own liberties. So citizens agree to establish a government and to give a legislature or an executive branch or a judicial branch authority because the alternative is worse. That if we are not governed, if there is no central authority who can keep the peace or assure that contracts are honored, then there will be lawlessness. So it is the people who form governments through what is sometimes or what is often called a social contract, that the people come together, they agree or they vote that we hereby form this government and we delegate to this government certain powers that they, as government officials, may execute. We can change that government, but no government can function unless it is given the power to operate. But that government only possesses those powers that have been expressly granted by the people, usually through a constitution. That's why all of our countries have constitutions as our core guiding document, just like any organization has a set of a charter or bylaws. Even HJI functions with a kind of government that's set up with a board of directors, a chairman of the board. The board of directors appoints the president, and then the president has powers, and there are other powers delegated to subsidiary parts of HGI, the faculty, the administrative staff, etc. And Locke believed that the law of nature limited what may be accumulated and decreed that no man can have such a portion of things of this world as to deprive his needy brother a right to the surplusage of his goods. That simply means that acquisition of wealth is not unlimited, and it should not be excessive such that it disempowers or prevents others from carrying out similar acts of labor and gaining property themselves. So this was an effort for Locke to kind of show his humanitarian side. These are stated in his treatises on government that are, again, key literature that the founding father, people like Jefferson and Franklin and James Madison and George Mason and John Adams, George Washington, they would be familiar with these European thinkers who had great influence during the period known as the Enlightenment. Another famous figure is Montesquieu, who's writing in the late, or really the 18th century, famous for the spirit of the laws. He identified three types of government. A democratic republic is one option, a monarchy is a second, and a despotism is a third. In despotism, the ruler has absolute authority and one obeys the ruler out of fear. In a monarchy, which is non-despotic, when a monarchy is non-despotic, then there is a love for and respect for hierarchy and for honor. And in a democratic republic, according to Montesquieu, there's love of virtue and puts the community ahead of private interest, but it is a democratic system. Montesquieu was among the first to articulate the three main branches of most governments, namely an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, and to underscore due process of law, that a democratic republic is characterized by rule of law, not by individual whim. So, like Locke, Montesquieu was very influential on the founders. There are also many other constitutional systems that emerged, particularly after the U.S. Declaration of Independence and its Constitution established in 1787. In Philadelphia, mentioned here is Simon Bolivar, who sought to set up something like a United States of South America, centering around the nation of Colombia, what's now Venezuela, and to expand more widely and ultimately in hopes of creating something similar. Simon Bolivar's efforts ended in failure, and he died a rather sad death, and those dreams were never realized. There's the example of the Republic of China, that's Taiwan, and its constitutional system has 5 branches. The U.S. system has executive, legislative, and judicial. The Taiwanese has legislative, executive, judicial, a civil service branch, and an audit branch. Some say that the 4th branch of the U.S. government is its bureaucratic apparatus with many different entities and agencies that operate virtually as branches of the government. But in principle and constitutionally, they're the three main bodies. Even the divine principle of HJI's founder, Reverend Moon, draws an analogy between the human body as having lungs, heart, and a stomach, and the brain, and a spinal cord, and a peripheral nervous system. And this is an analogy to the branches of government, a legislative, judicial, and executive branches, and sees this also rooted in principles that are part of God's principle of creation. Continuing in the vision of our founders was to establish a nation employing this separation of powers, but adding additional powers, but also trying to balance the left wing and the right wing. So there will be 5 powers: judicial, legislative, and administrative branches. There would be a 4th branch that would include the mass media, and a 5th that would be banking institutions. In this last quote, until now, the world has been governed under the separation of 3 powers, but from now on, things will move toward a separation of 5 powers. In terms of core documents of the U.S., here we can think of the Mayflower Compact of 1620, those that came over on the Mayflower and landed in Cape Cod up in Massachusetts near Boston. The Declaration of Independence of 1776, which is 150 years later than the Mayflower Compact. The U.S. Constitution in 1787, which is about 13 years after, or 11 years after the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights will be looking at. The Mayflower Compact, although a small group who came over on the Mayflower, this is the Mayflower Compact of 1620, a very short document that begins in the name of God, amen. And it simply, in a very simple way, lays out a plan for their self-government. Although a small group, and you can see the number of signers listed there, they did establish this compact, or some would call it a social contract or a social compact, social contract, where they agreed to abide by a certain system of governance among themselves. And this became a model that eventually each state that emerged among our colony of the United States adopted their own kind of compact or social contract or constitution. So the Compact of November 11th, 1620 starts for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. So it was a religious vision that guided them. They solemnly and mutually in the presence of God combine ourselves into a civil body politic, meaning we are establishing this government in the presence of God. Its purpose for the general good of the colony, and we promise all due submission and obedience. Obedience and submission to whom or to what? Well, it was to this body politic, this government under God, that they would abide by the laws that were established for their own benefit and security, how to organize things, how to distribute food, and so there would be someone who is appointed or elected to be in a more executive. They would have some kind of governing or judicial body in a way to make rules and regulations for this community so that they could, in fact, survive, and that they would stay together and not just each go off on their own and be left with great vulnerabilities as a result. But this would tie them together. One of the great principles or purposes of government is security, how to keep the people secure. Another key player in the development of thought in the United States is Thomas Paine and his writing known as common sense was deeply influential. He wrote this just 6 months before the Declaration of Independence. The time has come to correct the errors in Britain's constitution and to found new governments free of kings, free of hereditary rule, governments in which all officials owed their power to popular choice. So this was ideas that were very fertile and starting to be widespread that culminated in July of 1776. This is a painting of those who gathered to receive the Declaration of Independence. This is the five-person committee, drafting committee: Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and the other members of the committee. And this declaration is endorsed and signed and becomes official. And it is a radical move, and they are risking their very lives. Here again are the drafting committee that was set up months earlier. Jefferson was the primary drafter, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. I just put the schools that they attended to show that they were highly educated men. And there, Thomas Jefferson, the main drafter, was a Virginian, and also George Mason was, and he was a good friend of Jefferson, and Mason has helped draft documents related to Virginia. And Jefferson took some of George Mason's ideas. Mason had written that all men are born equally free and independent, and the wording in the Declaration for Jefferson is all men are created equal. In Mason, the wording was men have certain inherent natural rights of which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. Jefferson simply writes that there are certain unalienable rights, and he will describe them as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so Mason had written, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and attaining happiness. Jefferson was more succinct that these unalienable rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Later, after the Declaration, 90 some years later, Lincoln writes, the founders meant, quoting, simply declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to and constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly obtained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. So Lincoln is the president during the Civil War that could have brought an end to the United States as it had been known up until that time and divided the country over the issue of slavery. So the issue here that Lincoln is addressing and that the founders were very aware of, and that was the issue of slavery. And Lincoln is saying the founders, even though they were guilty of owning slaves, many of them, they nevertheless set this standard, according to Lincoln, of equality. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that this would be for all people, including enslaved people. But it took the Civil War to ultimately bring about that Emancipation Proclamation that brought an end to slavery. Prior to that, an end to the slave trade. Theodore Parker was a later figure in American history who was a strong abolitionist, which supported the end of slavery. He lived prior to the Civil War, and he had an idealistic vision of democratic governance, that it should be an ideal government, a reign of righteousness, a kingdom of justice, which all noble hearts long for and labor to produce, the ideal whereunto mankind slowly draws near. And I think this is a vision that's very much a spiritual, religious vision that one doesn't so often hear today, but that is similar to the Family Federation vision of governance as well. It goes on in this essay, The Present Crisis of 1856. Here is the American program of political principles. All men are endowed by their Creator with certain natural rights. In respect thereto, all men are equal. The Constitution itself is a provisional compromise between the ideal political principle of the Declaration and the actual selfishness of the people, North and South. So you could say there's an ideal, and yet Parker and others recognize that we live in a fallen world and fall short of these ideals. Parker goes on, the American Revolution, with American history since, is an attempt to prove by experience this transcendental proposition, to organize the transcendental idea of politics. The idea demands for its organization a democracy, a government of all, for all, by all, very clearly indicating all would include those enslaved peoples and those native indigenous people, the American Indians. The Articles of Incorporation, the year after the Declaration, were set up because there were 13 colonies. They were all independent states, we would say. They were not merged together into a single government. They were each self-government. So they were 13 countries. So Virginia and New Jersey and New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, they were each independent countries and were setting themselves up as such, drafting their own constitutions, drafting their own Bill of Rights. However, they were facing the ultimate threat of the United Kingdom and other European powers that may want to influence this continent of North America. And they realized there were vulnerabilities. If, for example, a state like Virginia were to ally itself with France, and a state like New York would ally itself with the British, then there may be wars even on the North American front between the allies of the French and the allies of the British, or the Spanish, and so on. So the question became, how can this group of 13 independent countries form some kind of coalition? So the step in that direction was to create the Articles of Confederation. And it states in Article 13, the articles of this confederation shall be inviolably observed by every state, and the unions shall be perpetual, nor shall any alteration at any time hereafter be made in any of them, unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States and be afterward confirmed by the legislatures of every state. So these articles were preliminary to the U.S. Constitution. They did not have an executive for these 13 states, meaning there wasn't a president who would oversee or govern the 13 states. There was no executive branch, and there was no judicial branch. There was kind of a Congress where representatives of these 13 independent sovereign states, so to speak, are not really sovereign yet, but they were seeking sovereignty, meaning independence as states. These articles were set up, and some of this is being forced by the Declaration is in some ways a declaration of war. There are already tensions and skirmishes between those living in the 13 colonies and the British forces, who wanted to maintain control and were seeking to legislate and tax the peoples of the 13 colonies. This was resented and strongly resisted. So this was the first step toward a constitution, namely the Articles of Confederation. Confederation tries to bring together in some kind of a federal system, meaning bringing it all together while allowing each state to maintain its independence. And I'm going to stop with that. And your task for this week is to read from the Declaration of Independence. Roughly speaking, it emerges in three parts, kind of a preamble that gives the reasons for why this declaration is being written and drafted. And then it is a list of about 18 grievances against the British king and monarchy, George III, and their tyranny over the colonies that the colonies are each rejecting. And hence they are saying, we now are separating from the British Empire, the greatest empire the world had known, and with a huge disciplined army. And yet they declared, swearing on their sacred honor and their treasure, that they would give their lives for this task. So they knew they were taking a major step that could lead to their execution if the British prevailed. And the Declaration is a beautiful document. And at this time in history, we reflect on its significance, and it impacted others all across the world. So I hope you enjoy your first module in this class, and I look forward to hearing from you. I'd like you to write a short bio so that I know a little bit more about you, and then also a short essay about the Declaration of Independence and some of these key founding documents of the United States. Great. Welcome to Human Rights Law and Government. All the very best. God bless you.